The following message was presented during the Friends of Israel Gospel Ministries 2018 Prophecy Conference season. Now here's Chris Katulka with a message from Matthew chapter 25, Christ's Judgment on the Nations.
Matthew chapter 25, we're going to round out our time together, the final section of the Olivet Discourse, and I believe Jesus is going to show us some interesting things here. You know, I answered a question yesterday on the panel discussion that somebody asked a great question, and they asked it to me, even somebody asked me a very similar question as I was coming in on the very first day on a Friday night. She goes, "What about the Gentiles? They're not there." Well, they are there. You know, the Gentiles are very present, even though we're looking at the Olivet Discourse from a very Jewish perspective. I tried to argue yesterday from the panel discussion that whenever you're talking about Jewish issues or looking at things from a Jewish perspective, you have to remember that God is using Israel as a conduit for what? Blessing to the world. So even when the disciples are saying, what's the end going to be like, Jesus? What's going on? In the very beginning of Matthew chapter 24, that is a loaded statement coming from the disciples, because what they're really asking is this: Jesus, you've shown us some amazing things in your ministry. You've challenged us on what the character of God is and who you are. Completely challenged us. You've turned everything we thought about the kingdom and everything we thought about the Messiah on its head. But I'm wondering, Jesus, are you going to do what the Old Testament prophets promised? Are you going to come as king and rule and reign and sit on your throne? Are you going to what? Do you remember what one of the aspects of a Messiah would do? Are you going to crush the enemies? Who are the enemies again? The unbelievers, the Romans, but who are they? They're not Jewish, they're Gentiles. So it's a loaded statement when you say, what's the end going to look like? Because included in that is the idea of Gentile judgment. And that's what we're going to look at now. I have something for you. If you have your notes, I have this. It says this: Old Testament prophets like Joel would often judge Israel for their sins against God. Joel did it. Ezekiel did it. Jeremiah did it. You know, most of the prophets are prophets judging their own people, but oftentimes they would break out. Look what I say here. They would judge Israel for their sins against God, and then those same prophets would turn and judge the nations, you see this? The nations for their excessive abuse of Israel. Do you remember in the Bible, God would sometimes call Gentile kings his servant, pagan kings his servant. And so some of those kings are like Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon or Cyrus the Great. He would often call them his servants. Why? Because those men were accomplishing a divine task that God had for Israel. Whether to punish Israel for their sins, or for Cyrus's case, to what? Return them to the land. God gave these pagan kings a job to do. He called them his servants. And so sometimes, though, as these Gentile nations were called to judge Israel, sometimes they would go a little too far. And God would turn around and what? Judge them for their excessive abuse of Israel. That's in the Old Testament. Jesus, who is a prophet, priest, and king, executes a similar prophetic structure in Matthew chapter 25. First, Jesus judges Israel for their preparedness or lack thereof concerning his second coming. Mike Stoller talked about that with the parable of the 10 virgins. And, you know, whenever parables deserve to be modernized. You know, that's the beauty of a parable. It's a story. And, you know, we can take those stories and modernize them a little bit for more modern cultures as well. And one of the things I like to do with the parable of the 10 virgins especially for my young adult crowd, is I always like to remind them, always keep your cell phone charged. Okay? Did you ever notice like even last night, I didn't charge my phone and I was driving here and it was in red. And I was like, man, I'm not prepared. If I get lost or whatever, my wife calls, I'm not prepared. I always like to use that for my crowds whenever I'm speaking on that. Keep your cell phone charged, okay? Be prepared. Because you never know what you're going to need to use your cell phone for. A light? Remember, your cell phone could be a light too, okay? Either way, we can modernize those stories a little bit. And so Jesus is judging Israel for their preparedness or lack thereof concerning his second coming. And then Jesus concludes the Olivet Discourse judging the nations for their mistreatment of the least of these my brothers. Okay, the least of these brothers of mine. So what do we see? Turn with me to Matthew chapter 25, and we're going to begin here as we get started in verse 31. And look what it says here. When the Son of Man comes, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Folks, isn't this what we've been waiting for? This is it. This is the moment. We've been waiting for this moment. The Son of Man comes and sits on his glorious throne. Remember, most of the things that we're talking about here, they're loaded statements. There's, we can just read right through that, but my word, there's so much Old Testament prophetic richness right in that one verse. We could spend an entire day talking about it. But I want to just highlight something really quickly. Jump back with me to Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7. Look what it says here. Daniel chapter 7. We're going to go to verse 13. Daniel is worried because he's seeing these beasts and he's seeing these events take place. These empires rise, these empires fall, but he's really concerned about this one beast, the Antichrist in the kingdom that he's bringing. He's nervous about it. And then God comforts his spirit a bit by pulling back the curtain a little more. And look, God reveals to Daniel a kingdom that's coming that's going to be unlike any other kingdom of the world. And look what it says here in verse 13. I saw in night visions, this is Daniel speaking, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a Son of Man. Where did we just see that, everybody? We just saw that in Matthew chapter 25 and verse 31. Jesus is saying when all this concludes and the Son of Man sits, what? On his glorious throne. So you have a direct connection between Daniel chapter 7 and Matthew chapter 25, verse 31. You have a direct connection through this phrase, Son of Man. And this is quite interesting, this phrase, Son of Man. I think I've talked about it in previous conferences here. But the Son of Man in Hebrew, Son of Man literally means human being. Ben Adam, Son of Man. You are all son of men. Okay, or daughters of men. You're humans. That's the idea. You are a human being. Ben Adam, you're human. But see, this human, this Son of Man, is totally different. That's what Daniel is in seeing here. Look what it says. So this human, let's replace Son of Man with human. Watch this. Verse 13. I saw in night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, there came one like a human. He came to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him. There is a person in Daniel's mind, a human, that is coming on what? Clouds. Have you ever met a human that comes on clouds? I never have. And even if you take this as figurative, because there are some scholars that go, this person isn't like, cloud surfing. It's the image of the idea that he is literally, just as you remember when the tabernacle was established, what came down in Exodus chapter 40? A cloud by day and a fire by night. So even if you want to take that in that realm, you're still highlighting a glory aspect to it. Okay, either way, you have the Son of Man, a human, remember that, a human that's doing very unhuman-like things, like riding on clouds. Like, look at the other one. Who does he approach? Who does this human approach? He approaches God. He approaches the Ancient of Days. Let me ask you a question. Can you just approach God whenever you want? No. Well, yes, as a believer, once you die and your body is resurrected, yes, you can. But even now, you would be consumed. You would be consumed. That's why we need our resurrected body, so that we can approach the holiness of God. But think about this. Here is a human being in the Old Testament that's just walking right up to God. Even Moses, do you remember Moses is begging God toward the end of Exodus around chapter 34? He's saying, God, show me yourself. I want to know you. I want to see you. And God's like, I can't show you. You will be consumed. But you know what I'll do? I'll show you my back. How's that? And you can get a little tiny, little itty bitty glimpse of who I am. I'll take it, Moses says. Do you remember what Moses looked like when he came off the... do you remember that? I mean, the Israelites were like, whoa, 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 Moses. Were you in a tanning bed? What's going on, you know? There is this image that's shown where Moses is even changed by the slightest little glimpse of God's holiness and glory. And here is a human who does divine things that can just walk right into the presence of the Ancient of Days. Who is this person? Look at, even old Jewish scholars, writers before Jesus were highlighting this as a very messianic prophecy. Look what it says here. And to him, this Son of Man, verse 14, and to him was given what? Dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, do you hear this? Listen to this loaded, remember we're talking about how loaded that one passage is. And Jesus kind of just reads right through it. But remember what would have been going through the mind of the disciples. They would have gone right here. And look at, to him, that Son of Man, the one who can approach God, the Ancient of Days, to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom that all peoples, not just Jewish people, do you hear this? Not just Jewish people, all peoples, nations, and languages should what? Serve him. Paul picks up on this in Philippians chapter 2, and what does he say? Every knee shall, every tongue, that Jesus Christ is Lord. Paul picks up on this concept that one day everybody would bow. Not just the Jewish people who would worship him as the King of Israel. The whole world would see him as the King of Israel, the King of the world. And look what it says. To him was given a dominion, an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom one that shall not be destroyed. I could end right there. How about you all? Call today? All right. We can end on a good note. But here's what's happening. Let's flip back to Matthew chapter 25. This is what Jesus is talking about. Look, when he says the Son of Man is going to come in his glory, as I have up here, and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne. Okay, and when he sits on his glorious throne, what does that carry the idea of? You know, when someone sits on a throne, especially in Jesus' day, during the days of David, Solomon, they carry with them both the title of king and also the title of judge. They're judge. You know, remember Solomon? Solomon does a great thing. The moment that he's given the Spirit, he's anointed king. You know, whenever I like to take people to Israel, we get to Hezekiah's tunnel where the Gihon spring comes up. And that is where Solomon was anointed king of Israel. He rode a donkey down to the Gihon spring, it says. Just like Jesus did. Remember, Jesus riding on a donkey, everybody, that doesn't mean he's humble. That's not the donkey. Solomon rode. You know what David said when Solomon was anointed king of Israel? David is about to die and he says, give Solomon my donkey. You know, you would think he'd say, give him my white horse or something. No. The donkey is a kingly image. It does carry with it some aspects of lowliness, but even more than that is that when Jesus is coming down on a donkey fulfilling the prophecies of Zechariah chapter 9, it's more than that. It's actually going back to the idea that even David gave Solomon a donkey to ride down to the Gihon spring to be anointed king of Israel. It's interesting. I always like to bring the kids there or whoever I'm leading on a tour, and we shout, long live the King of Israel, Solomon, just as the text says, and we scream it into the tunnel together. It's a lot of fun. And sometimes I'll take some water and pour it on a kid's head. That person doesn't like it that much, but I like to keep people surprised. But when a king sits on his throne, it's not just the fact that he is ruling. Solomon, when he sat on his throne, he wanted wisdom. Why did he want wisdom? So that he could judge the people with God's righteousness. So that he could judge the people properly. That's the reason he wanted God's wisdom. That he could judge rightly. I mean, we're going through an issue right now in the United States of America where we're trying to appoint what? A Supreme Court judge. And we want somebody who's going to be what? Someone who looks at the we don't want a rocket scientist. We just want somebody that's going to look at the text in its original form and interpret it. We don't want somebody that's going to be a social justice judge coming in and applying things onto the Constitution. We want somebody who's going to rightly apply wisdom to what the founders wrote down. Amen. That's all we're looking for. Okay, and so we want someone who sits on that court with wisdom. Now, that's human wisdom. You know what Solomon asked God for was divine wisdom. Wisdom that only he could give. And Jesus sitting on this glorious throne is begging or is showing God that showing us that he is longing for wisdom so that he can judge. In John chapter 5, verse 27, I have this. You can write it down. But the idea is, look at Jesus becomes judge who hands out eschatological blessing, that's future prophetic blessing, or punishment. Jesus is given that authority. You can see it in John chapter 5, verse 27. And you even see this idea of God's judgment or God's judge aspect coming from Jerusalem, the way that he judges the people of Israel, the tribes of Israel, and even the world, from a very famous psalm that we like to look at, Psalm 122. What does it say in Psalm 122? You remember? Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Psalm 122, verse 6. But can I tell you something that's interesting? If you go back just one or two verses, it says that within Jerusalem, David's talking about Jerusalem. And he says this, he says, thrones were set in Jerusalem. The thrones of Israel were set there. Why? So that judgment could go out into the world. Micah chapter 4, again, Isaiah, these prophecies that Jerusalem would become the place where judgment is sent out. And so we see that Jesus becomes an eschatological, a future judge who's going to bring both blessing to people and punishment. Now look what it says here in verse 32 as we continue on in Matthew chapter 25. It says this, before him will be gathered all the nations. Just like going back, remember, we're going back to Daniel chapter 7, all the nations, every tribe, every tongue, all of these people, look at every nation comes to Jesus. Look at this. And he will separate people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. So now we have Jesus, the future judge. Well, he's a judge now, but when he sits on his throne, he's going to mete out divine judgment in the future. And he's going to separate sheep, right hand, right, Chris? Right hand. Yep, that's good. Goats. I used to take karate when I was a kid, and every time the guy would say, left hand, I'd go like this. Right hand. And I could just see my mom going over there like, oh, this guy's got a long road ahead of him. On the right hand are the sheep, and on the left hand, we're going to talk about that a little bit. But the picture that we see here is that there is judgment that's coming. Only Jesus is the one who's given the ability to separate these two groups. There's a scholar. His name's Ulrich Luz, and he writes a great commentary on the book of Matthew. And he says this: Jesus becomes essentially the world judge. And he divides the righteous and the unrighteous and puts the former on the right, the good side, and the latter on the left, the bad side. He pronounces his verdict at the very beginning. Notice this. He pronounces his verdict at the very beginning, unlike an earthly judge does not have to have a hearing to discover the truth. Do you hear that? Look at what we go through. The process that we go through in our American court system, which we have an amazing system that actually doesn't announce someone guilty before, they even have a court case. I like to lead people. We live in the Philadelphia area, and whenever we have our workers from the international team come over. I've become the tour guide for Philadelphia. And so Mike Stollard will say, hey, Chris, let's go take, we just took Colin over not too long ago, and we went to Independence Hall. And we did a tour of Independence Hall where the Declaration of Independence was signed. And so while you're standing there, you see what a colonial courtroom looked like. And the guilty person, the person who was caught stealing or whatever, stood in a cage. The iron, it was about a half, came up to about here, and it went around you. And the docent leading the tour said, does this person look innocent? If I'm standing here with my back facing the crowd and I'm in a cage, do I look innocent? No, you look guilty. Right away you look guilty. And so one of the amazing things about the American system is that you're innocent until proven guilty. And so that's a totally different from what the colonial system looked like or any other system looked like, that you're innocent until proven guilty. And that's because what we're admitting when it comes to justice, what we're admitting is something quite interesting. We're admitting we don't know. You see what I'm saying? Nobody has, no one has, unless you have a video camera that proves you're guilty, you're only going on word in a case and evidence. You need a jury. You need someone that's going to determine what this thing looks like. And so you're innocent until proven guilty. But see, that's because we don't know truth. We don't know the full picture until we go through the trial. But see, we don't need that with Jesus. Do you see? That's what this commentator is saying. He's bringing the verdict down because he is the truth bearer. He is the one. He can actually bring the verdict in the beginning because Jesus is the truth. He is the wisdom of God. He is the righteousness of God. He is all of that. He understands everything, and he does it with a heart for the people, but also understanding God's righteousness. And that is why he is able to announce a verdict right away. He's separating the sheep from the goats right away without having to do a trial. Isn't that interesting? And so look what happens here. We're talking about this idea of, look at separating sheep from goats. This is interesting. He's considered a shepherd. I want to read from you from Ezekiel chapter 34. And you don't have to go there. You can just listen. And I actually have it up here on the text too. Jesus is considered, he's saying, he's considering himself as a shepherd. So here's a judge. And he's saying, I'm like a shepherd who's separating the sheep from the goats. But this idea of shepherd goes back to Ezekiel chapter 34, verse 23. Look, I will set one shepherd over them, that's Israel, and he will feed them, namely my servant David. He will feed them and will be their shepherd. Do you see what God's saying in Ezekiel? It's a fascinating chapter to read because, see, Ezekiel is highlighting the fact that the reason the Israelites were sent to Babylon, that the reason that they were scattered, the reason that they were exiled out of Israel, out of and punished and the temple was destroyed, was because they left God. They followed other gods. And then you know what Ezekiel does? He comes back and says, it's not just because they decided to leave God, it's because they were led that way by their leaders. Their leaders forgot about them. The people of Israel, during the days of Ezekiel, they were punished by God because their leadership forgot to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and to lead the people properly. He called them the shepherds of Israel. And God says, woe to you, you shepherds of Israel. You were getting fat, he said, while my people, my sheep, were starving. You were getting rich and doing injustice while my people were suffering. Woe to you, shepherds. God lays it hard on them. Who else does that? Ezekiel does that. Who else lays into the leadership of Israel? Jesus does. He picks up right on this theme. But look at I love what God says. You know what? I'm going to get my own shepherd. A good shepherd. Namely, my servant David. David's been long dead when Ezekiel writes this. He's talking about a son of David. Who's a son of David, everybody? Jesus, that's right. And he will feed them and will be their shepherd. I want you to hear some other of what Ezekiel says. He says this, as for you, my sheep, this is what the sovereign Lord says. The sheep are the people of Israel. But we're going to see it's a little different when we get to Matthew chapter 25. As for you, my sheep, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Look, I am about to judge between one sheep. Listen, I'm going to judge between one sheep and another. Between rams and goats. It is not enough for you to feed on the good pasture that you must trample the rest of the pasture with your feet. When you drink clean water, must you muddy the rest of the water by tramping on it with your feet? As for my sheep, they must eat what you trampled on with your feet and drink what you have muddied with your feet. This idea that the sheep were led astray and by the leaders of Israel, and now God is going to mete out his justice by separating the good sheep and the bad sheep. Did you hear that? I'm going to separate the rams and the goats, the sheep. There's an idea of separation that takes place here. And God is going to bring that, or Jesus is going to bring that into the judgment of the nations now. You know, it's interesting. Scholars have found out that when Hanukkah arrives, during the days of Jesus, the liturgy of the synagogue service would change. And what I mean by that is this. All of a sudden, what they were saying and what they were singing in the synagogue during the days of Jesus around the Hanukkah season changed. And we do that. When Christmas rolls around, what are we singing? Christmas carols. Ones that point us to Christ. One that points us to the birth of Christ. You know, we change our way of worship when Christmas rolls around. During Hanukkah, the whole liturgy would change. The worship service would change in the synagogue. And you know what they would sing? They would sing and read passages from Ezekiel chapter 34. And they would highlight the idea, how could it be that only one man, talking about Matthias Maccabeus, one man stood up against the Greeks? Only one. Every other leader of Israel was slaughtering pigs in allegiance to Antiochus Epiphanes. How come only one stood up? And that's what they would sing about. How could it be that only one? There was only one shepherd that led the way. They all should have said no, but only one stood up. And that's when Jesus stands up. Think about this. Jesus stands up in the middle of all that singing about a shepherd and the people leaders leading the people astray. All of that singing is going on, and Jesus stands up in John chapter 10 during Hanukkah and says, I'm the good shepherd. I'm the good shepherd. You want a leader who can feed you, who cares about you, who wants to watch over you and usher you and lead you to streams of living water? I'm your shepherd. Isn't that awesome? That's just a little free information, okay? So, here we go. Why the sheep and the goats? We're talking about the nations here. We see that happened with Israel and Ezekiel, but what about the nations now as Jesus brings us to the nations? It's interesting. The Greek words there for sheep and goat don't necessarily mean sheep and goat. I'm sorry, you know, that actually comes from Luther during the Reformation. He made that popular, and we even use that. You know, I like to separate my sheep and goat a lot in my house, my kids. You're my favorite. You're not, okay? Today, at least. You know, who's on my good side, who's on my bad side. So that we separate our sheep and our goats. That's something that actually comes from Luther. But it's interesting, when you look at the Greek words there for sheep and goat, it's not that clear that it's sheep and goats. The meaning is the same. The meaning is exactly the same. God is going to separate the nations based upon what they did and how they acted. We're going to see toward Israel in a moment. But let's talk just a really quick moment about these sheep and goats. It's interesting. Scholars ask, why separate sheep and goats? What's up with that? Now, when you think of sheep, right now, everyone tell me what comes to your mind when you think sheep. Go. Dumb, good. But like as a picture, if you're seeing a sheep, when you're seeing a sheep, what do you see? Wool. And what color is that wool? It's white. And I already know what's in your mind the moment you see that sheep. You see this big green rolling hill, right? And right up on top of it is this bright white woolly sheep, right? Am I right? Okay. That's not Israelite sheep during the days of Jesus. How many people here been to Israel before? Did you ever see a Bedouin that's shepherding sheep and goats? They don't look like the sheep and goats we're used to. Okay, they actually look a lot alike. The sheep and goats look a lot alike when you see them together and they're mashed together. They're not this pretty white, beautiful little sheep. No, they're kind of dirty. They're in the dirt. They're nasty. They're with the goats, the sheep, and you got this shepherd who's leading them around in the desert, in the wilderness. It's not as pretty, the scenery that we're used to seeing. So the first thing scholars say is, well, you know what? They're separated because they look alike in the beginning. And so we have to separate them. And the shepherd would have to separate them at night because some scholars argue that the goats would get cold at night. So they need to be kept warm, and the sheep would be warmer, so they would separate them at night. Others argued goats would need to be milked. So they would pull the goats aside to milk them and remove them from the sheep. But the problem with all of this is that word for goat. It actually isn't talking about a goat. It's actually a young livestock. That's the word that's there. Young livestock. And in this book called the Septuagint, which is it's during the days of Jesus, they didn't just have the Hebrew writings in the Old Testament. They also had the Hebrew writings written in Greek. They translated the Hebrew into Greek. That's called the Septuagint. So they had a Greek Old Testament. And anytime this word, the same word that's used for goat here, appears, it's actually a young animal that's getting ready for sacrifice or to be eaten, or something that has to do with its death, its impending end. And so the word for sheep can actually mean, I hate to do this to you, everybody, I know this is confusing. The actual word for sheep can actually mean sheep or goats. It can mean sheep or goats. It's small livestock in the Hebrew. But when you get to the goat word, this is where the distinction comes into play. Some scholars argue, that word in the Old Testament in Greek, the same one Jesus is using, is used for sacrifice. A young animal that's getting ready for sacrifice. And so is what's going on here, is Jesus actually saying this side is the right side? See, I went with my left. The right side is coming over here. They're the good side, and they're being, led this way because they have a future ahead of them. But this side is what? Entering into death. So again, scholars argue back and forth on this issue. It's not a settled issue because there isn't much writing on it, but the meaning stays the same. God is separating the sheep from the goats. Now watch what happens here as we go on. Let's see. He puts the sheep on his right, the goats on his left. And look what it says here in Matthew 25, 34 through 40. Then the king will say to those on his right, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food." Have you ever heard this before? I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I was naked, and you gave me clothing. I was sick, and you took care of me. I was in prison, and you visited me. Now, this is interesting because I actually think what Jesus is highlighting here is nothing more than what the law demanded. The Old Testament law demanded of its people. The Old Testament law, the one thing that it should have taught, if you read the Old Testament law, the one thing that it taught more than anything was how you are supposed to relate with who? God. And how you're supposed to relate with each other. And the law never pitted you above another person. Do you hear me? The law never pitted you above. It never said, oh yeah, you rise to the top here. No, the law actually did as much as it possibly could that the rich might help the poor, and that the poor might be blessed by others, that those who are hungry would be fed by others, that those who are thirsty would be taken care of, that those who are naked would be clothed. The law did those things. Think about it. Even as 70 years rolled on in Israel, do you remember this? What was the year called every 70th year in what was it? Year of Jubilee, when all what are canceled? Debts. Do you know what God was trying to prevent? A monopoly of one person grabbing land. That's why at the end of 70 years, what happened? It all reset. Because in the law, God wanted to make sure everybody was given the opportunity possible, whether you're poor. Look at 70 years can do a lot. A lot of things can be, I mean, Amazon was only created, 20 years ago, and they practically rule the world now, okay? Anything can happen in a short amount of time. And so God wants to make sure that the law takes care of everybody. And here, I think Jesus is just highlighting what the Old Testament law talks about. James chapter 1, verse 27, when James talks about what true religion is. Do you remember what he says? Taking care of the widows and orphans. This idea of people who can't take care of themselves in that moment, we should be the ones as the church, stepping in. Okay? That it goes back to Old Testament law. And I think Jesus, I love what the disciples say here. Look what it says. It goes on as he's talking about all this. And he said, the disciples, the people say to him, then the righteous will answer him, sorry, the righteous, not the disciples. The righteous answer him and say, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? And when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, or naked and clothe you? And when did we see you sick or in prison or visit you? And then the king will answer them, truly I say to you, as you did it to one of these, the least of these, my brothers, you did it to me. There are many times in Jewish literature where this concept of hungry, homeless, naked, debtors, thirsty, poor, innocent, strangers, dead, you see mourning, all of this idea in Jewish literature is summed up several times. God judges Israel actually for their for not taking care of their own according to what the law demanded. And Jesus is saying during the tribulation, now he's talking to nations, and he's saying, you saw my brothers. Who are my brothers in this context here? They're the Jewish people. The nations. God judges the nations for this moment in Jewish history, in the future tribulation, judges the nations for how they cared for his own people. Now it flips back to the nations, goes right to Joel chapter 3. If you have your Bibles, let's do that. Let's go to Joel chapter 3. Joel chapter 3, verse 2. I had to put my marker in that one because Joel is often, even if you've been to seminary, it's hard to find those minor prophets sometimes. One page sticks and you're up here for 10 minutes looking around for Joel. Joel chapter 3, listen to this. For behold, in those days at that time, when I will restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations. You hear this? All the nations, and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which scholars will often believe that's the Kidron Valley that sits between the Temple Mount and the Mount of Olives. But there's also a word play going on here because Jehoshaphat, literally in Hebrew, means the valley of judgment. So God's going to judge them. And I will enter into judgment with them there, the nations, on behalf of my people. Do you hear what God's doing? He's entering into judgment with the nations. Matthew chapter 25. He's entering into judgment with the nations for what? How they treated who? My people. Who are my people? The Jewish people. On my behalf and my people and my heritage, Israel. Because they have, scattered them among the nations. Folks, Jewish people are still being scattered. Do you know that? Think about it. Right now, I just read an article that said that the Jewish people of London, a large majority of Jewish people, I shouldn't say majority, 40%, which is a lot, that live in London, might leave England altogether. Might leave England if Corbyn becomes prime minister because of his anti-Semitism. Israel just a few years ago saw a massive spike in French immigration to Israel because of what? Anti-Semitism. They're being scattered still because of anti-Semitism and the way nations treat them. Of course, we want them to go to Israel. That's the best place to go. But they don't all go to Israel. Some go to Canada. Some come here. So they're being scattered among the nations, have divided up my land. Does that sound familiar? Divide up my land? The nations are constantly wanting to what? Divide God's land. Even Bruce was up here talking about last night the idea that during the Clinton administration, they wanted to what? Divide the Temple Mount from top to bottom. The nations wanted to divide the land and cast lots for my people and have traded a boy for a prostitute and have sold a girl for wine and have drunk it. How the nations treat Israel during the tribulation, and I even think now as well, is going to determine God's blessing for them in the future as well. It all goes back, folks. I'm going to jump ahead here because look at, I got 6 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2. All right. Now, Genesis 12, 1 through 3. Steve's not laughing at all. And my office is next to him, so I better hurry up. Genesis 12, 1 through 3. I will bless those who... and curse those who curse you. You know, Jim Showers, I had him on the radio program a couple months ago, and we were talking about this passage. And, you know, he said something profound. He said, this isn't just about Christians blessing Israel, that passage, Genesis 12. It's about the nations, even unbelievers, blessing Israel. Oftentimes, I always think of that passage in realm of a Christian understanding of blessing Israel. But Jim reminded me in that moment, this isn't just about Christians blessing Israel. It should be our duty as Christians because we know God's word. That passage, Genesis, is about even the nations, unbelievers, blessing Israel. I love Balaam and Balak. One of the greatest, most comedic stories in the whole Bible. A guy is paid to curse Israel. He's paid, and he shows up, and he goes to just lay into them, and the only thing he can do is what? A pagan blessing Israel. Folks, that's what the nations will be divided through when Jesus sits on his throne. They will be divided for the way they treat Israel. And that's what this whole thing is about. And you know what? As a reminder, I don't need to tell you all this. I'm preaching to the choir. Bless Israel. Bless the Jewish people. Remember them. I don't care if you live here in Lancaster. I don't care if there's a Jewish person that lives 100 miles away from you. Think of ways that you can bless them. Maybe they're your neighbor. Maybe you've never even met one before. That's okay. Actually, you all should have met one. He stands up here all the time. I'm going to tell you, it is really important that you bless Israel and the Jewish people because it shows where you understand where God has put his value in not only ministering to them, but ministering to everybody.